Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar and basically our first global presentation on our Planify cockpit for Business Data Cloud. My name is Ingo Hilgefort. I'm going to be the presenter and the host for this webinar. I will try to keep the slides as quick and slim as possible because I simply want to show the product live to see what things can do, and I also want to have a little bit of time for Q&A. So before we get started, just kind of quick, who is actually Simplify, who is Planify. So Simplify is a long-term partner for the SAP analytics and data management area. So we do things like, SAP Analytics Cloud, the BI portion, planning, Datasphere, BW, HANA. We do things like BPC, group reporting, and obviously Business Data Cloud. On the Planify side, that's basically our branding for our out-of-the-box solutions. We do have out-of-the-box solutions for planning, for things like consolidation, where we come with pre-configured content, and that's why the cockpit you will also see being branded as the Planify brand. So I assume that if you join the webinar, you're familiar with Business Data Cloud, you're familiar with Datasphere as well, and probably not just for a few days, but for quite some time. So the questions that you see currently on the slide should feel very familiar. Sometimes there's questions around where did the data come from? What is going to break when we make changes? And this could be changes on an entity level. This could be changes even down to a column level. What about making sure that you have consistent metadata? Everybody keeps talking about AI these days, but if you have one model, it's a customer, the next model, it's customer ID, and the third model, it's customer name, and the fourth model, it's customer name again, then obviously that's inconsistent. And the AI tool might not right away notice that these four are actually all the same things. They are your customer, and simply because you didn't label them in a consistent way. So if we look at it from a slightly different perspective, there's actually time being spent on these items. Let's take a very simple example. You made a change, perhaps in a view, you made a change in a table. This could mean labels, this could mean data types, but based on the change, some of your analytical models are breaking. Now you're going to have to basically go through, where did the break happen? What happened? Which version do you have to perhaps bring back? What changes do you have to make? This isn't just happening in 5 minutes. So you're going to have to make sure in your development system you fix it, you're moving things to production again. On other items, think about the lineage, being able to actually find out where the data come from. Perhaps you have basically a data issue in your production system. So now you want to go from your analytical model and trace back, where did the calculation happen? What is the calculation? Where did the source data come from? So all these things are basically costing, so to speak, time and money at the end, which is why basically we created the Planify cockpit. We're focusing on 3 main areas, and we will walk through several use cases and demos. The first is plainly the visibility. So we give you the option to do a full lineage. We do give you the option to do an actual impact analysis from an entity level, from a column level. You can choose, for example, a column from the local table and see what happens, which objects are impacted if you make a change, for example, to this column. We also give you something called orphaned assets. You might actually have items in your system that are not used by anything. So why do they still exist? They might use space actually in your system beyond the fact that they basically just sitting there. We'll also allow you to compare assets. Remember, we talked about breakage. Perhaps you want to compare something from your development system with what actually is in production and see the differences. On the governance, on the quality part, we actually do allow you to check if your objects follow your naming conventions, and I will show that in the demo. So you can actually make sure you have your naming conventions established, and then you can check your assets against it. I already touched on the label consistency. We show you based on basically all your entities that you have, if you have inconsistent namings. You want to update metadata, and you just don't want to go into every table manually or every view manually. You want to do, for example, a bulk update. We do actually allow you to download the metadata, for example, into a spreadsheet, update it in the spreadsheet, and bring it back into Datasphere. We also allow you to move assets. In this case, the move is not from a dev to QA to production system that's well established on the SAP side. We're allowing you to move assets between spaces. We have customers where they have only dev and QA in one landscape and production in one. So in this case, moving things between spaces, switching connections between the spaces, that's what we're talking about. And then on the plain operations item, we're talking about being able to export things, being able to, for example, see all your tasks. If you're the administrator and you know that you have replication flows, transformation flows, you have persistency schedules, you have task chains running. Today inside of Datasphere, there is no Outlook calendar, so to speak, that shows you all your jobs running and when are they running. You might actually have overlaps. So this is what the task schedule allows you to do. We also have documentation. Simply generate documentation for a complete space with the full details. What are the tables, the views, the fields, the flows, and everything. So let's go into the details. So let's start with the lineage. Today, you do have lineage and impact inside of Datasphere, but it is not 100% complete yet. So what I mean by that is, depending on your model complexity, some of the items might actually not show up in the lineage inside of Datasphere. Transformation flows, replication flows, they actually not always picked up as part of the lineage, just to give you one example. What we actually showing you, and I will show it in the live demo, is a complete end-to-end lineage and impact analysis where everything is basically shown. We're talking upstream, downstream. So really down to an entity as well, column level, including calculations. So in our lineage, you can actually select, for example, a calculation in an analytical model, and it will show you the trace back of where the source elements of this calculation are actually coming from. So to show you a little bit heads up before we then later on go into the live demo, and depending on your screen, this might not look like great. So give me a few minutes for the demo then. This is basically the lineage. You can see the different asset types from dimensions, fact models, task chains, and everything, and down to a column level. So what you're seeing right now is where I'm highlighting an analytical model on the right hand side. It shows all the columns that are being used in the analytical model, but more importantly, it actually even allows me to drill down into the details of calculations, showing me the source of the elements of each calculation. The other part is the impact, and you have the ability in our tool to basically go in and choose if you want to see an impact analysis based on an entity, based on a column of an entity, or based on a source connection. Perhaps you want to see all the entities that are connecting to, for example, your Azure Data Lake. And what we then basically show is one, a plain list that if you wanted, you can even export it. And we will also show you the complete dependency tree in this case, It shows the dependencies from a local table. And if you're going down to field level, it will show you actually where the column that you selected, in this case from a local table, is being used. Let's talk a little bit about metadata and how we can help you. So imagine you basically have a project and where basically you have multiple teams, multiple consultants, external, internally, basically helping you with your Datasphere projects. This doesn't always mean that everybody is following the same, like, naming convention. People might name a customer, and the next person might call it a customer name. So what we actually allowing you to do is, one, you can actually enter your naming convention rules as part of our product, and you can validate those rules against what is actually being deployed in your system. If you're familiar with Datasphere, you probably know that naming conventions aren't enforced yet. So right now, the naming convention is more like an after the fact story, but at least we give you the option to validate have they been followed, and if not, you basically can intervene. We do also give you a report on like consistency of the labeling, and if you want to change, you even have the option to basically do a bulk change, as I mentioned, by, for example, getting the actual like Excel sheet with all the labels. You can change it in the Excel sheet, upload it, and we will make the necessary changes. So as an example, you see a screenshot where you can, for example, follow the naming conventions. In my case, I just made it very simple. We have an analytical model in the local table naming rules, and then the system comes back and says, well, we have like 25 items that are not following the rule, and I can now follow up on this. The third area I wanted to touch on is the backup, kind of like, and being able to compare items. So yes, it's a software as a service solution, and SAP is responsible for their backup. And yes, there are versions inside of Datasphere available now, but we still get from time to time the question, like, for example, is there a way, for example, to export everything? And perhaps your system of choice is, for example, GitHub, to actually take your JSON files and have them pushed into GitHub. Those things can actually be done. Like you can have like single export, complete bulk export, space definitions, all those items can be exported. The other part that we allow you to do is being able to compare actually an item on your dev system with the item on the production system, and it will go down to pretty much every item in that definition and show you if there is a difference and where the difference is, even down to, like, if you wish, you can see the complete JSON details of both items. The other part I want to talk about is the transport portion. So there is today, out of the box with Datasphere, the ability to move objects between your dev QA and production system. Moving things between spaces is not something that basically happens out of the box. So if you have your landscape, for example, only has like 2 Datasphere systems, or potentially even just one, and you're managing dev and production in form of spaces, then you basically have the choice to manually export items, which then brings on top the fact that you still need to change connections, which, obviously means you have to inspect manually the JSON, go in, find exactly where the connections is, what you have to replace it with, and so on. So this is exactly where we can come in and help. We basically have automated that part. We allow you to choose the assets from a space. We allow you to bring in all the dependent objects as well, so that you can make sure that if you're moving an analytical model, that pretty much like all the views and tables and transformations are being moved as well. And we can deploy it into another space, including the option to switch your connection details. The other part that we do offer is what I call a transport list. We've seen occasionally, basically, that when you go to SAP and you select, for example, an analytical model that you need to move from dev to QA to production, that the list that based on dependencies is suggested is incomplete. And that's why we went in, we created a tool where, if you select our product and give you a transport list, so it will show you all the depending objects that you then have to make sure goes into the package. So you can see the UI here. You get to choose the model. You get to choose basically if you want to see upwards or downwards dependencies or both. And then we generate basically a spreadsheet for you. But the important part is not only that we show you dependent objects, but also includes configurations that today are not being moved yet. So if you're moving replication flows, we will also tell you what the configurations are in terms of schedule. The same for task chains, the same for transformation flows. Those are items that when you move between dev QA production, you still have to manually in production switch on. So that's why we're basically giving you all this information in one spot so that when things are in production, you can actually make the last configuration changes. So let's talk about another time about the metadata. Now we're talking about basically updating things. So today, if you want to change, for example, labels inside of Datasphere, it's a manual effort. It's a asset by asset effort. We do allow you to basically do this in bulks, and we also basically give you the option if you wanted to use it, for example, a spreadsheet. So as an example, we show you actually inconsistencies. Like you can see on the screen right now, the system inspected your Datasphere space, and it shows you that you have technical items with different descriptions. So it gives you the option to follow up on that. We also allow you, for example, to copy actually labels. If you work with Datasphere, for example, with replication flows and transformation flows, you probably know that if there is a remote table with nice technical names and nice descriptions, and you create a replication flow, that your local table might be missing those descriptions. Now, if we're talking like hundreds of fields, now you're spending several minutes on this. This is exactly where this can come in. It can simply take all the labels from, for example, a remote table and copy it one-to-one to your local table if you wish. The other part we allow you to do is actually update semantics. You can either do that in our product, or, for example, you can download items into a spreadsheet, make the change, upload it. The last item I want to show is basically the scheduling item. So if you setting up task chains, data flow schedules, replication flow schedules, all those things, today inside of Datasphere, there is no option for you to see how these things overlap on a daily, weekly, or monthly level, simply to see how much load are you actually putting on the system. So that is where we can basically bring in the overall view. Similar, think about like a calendar for your tasks that are actually running in your system to give you an idea potentially if you're overloading your system with too much elements. So it shows you broken down your different kind of jobs that are running on a daily, weekly, monthly level. On the documentation part, it is pretty straightforward. We're pretty much with the single press of a button, we generate complete documentation of all your different entities types, and with the full-fledged details like a view with the different fields and labels and which views are being used, what kind of sources are being used, pretty much a complete documentation in form of a Word and PDF document that you can actually use also as documentation for your project. But let me actually show how this looks and feels in the actual product. So you should basically be seeing now the live product. So you can see we have the different areas around the lineage, the metadata management, transports, task management, documentation. So let's take a quick look at the lineage first. So you can see the system is asking me which space I want to connect to. And I'm simply saying I want to run the lineage for my complete space. And then I go to the visualize part. So now you can see on the left-hand side, I have the different object types. I can choose basically if I want to see technical names or if I want to see business names or both. And then I select, in this case, my analytical model, and I can choose to either click on it one by one, or I can, for example, say, look, show me everything that is involved in building this analytical model. And the important part is, as I mentioned, this goes down to column level. So you can see on the right-hand side, it shows you all the dependencies. It shows you all the different columns. And if, for example, I go down to the calculation, you can see here, it shows you exactly where this actually comes from. So let me, for example, go to a calculated measure. It highlights on the canvas. This is where the elements are coming from. It shows you what the actual calculation is, where these calculation elements are coming from. So a real lineage, basically, top down, down to even the column level. We allow you to basically use a live connection as well. If you prefer, you can basically hand us a set of JSON files and we would do pretty much the same. So now if I go to the opposite, so instead of seeing the lineage, I want to know, I have to make a change to a certain kind of object. And what are the impacted objects? So first of all, I have the option to choose an asset impact. So this is like on an entity level. I have the column option and I have the connection option. So if I want to see, if I make changes to this connection, what are actually the source elements that are going to be impacted by this? So let's use the entity. And in this case, I want to take a local table. So I choose to now get the list of local tables. And here's my list of local tables that I have. And then I can go in and say, okay, if I actually make a change on the table employees, what are the things that I need to watch out for? What are dependencies? And this is the important part. It doesn't just show you the direct dependencies, it shows you the complete tree. So it goes all the different levels, and you can, you get the list, you get the visual, so it shows you pretty much all the items. The other part, we also created what I call a visual explorer. This goes a little bit more in depth if you would like. So this is basically now giving you two different visuals for the lineage and impact. So let's choose our analytical model again. On the right-hand side, you can now see what is being referred to as a dependency matrix. So at the bottom, you see our analytical model, and it shows all the different assets that are somehow involved building this analytical model, and it shows the different dependency types. So from an association, there are task chains that are actually being involved. And then if I want to, I can actually go down and see the visual representation, and I can choose the depth of dependencies on the lineage as well as on the impact side. And let me show you the difference. So if I go lineage to level 3, it shows all the different items. But you see there's task chains involved. And the task chains are actually not a direct dependency for my analytical model. Instead, they are actually part of views for persistencies. So if I'm not interested on those, I can say, well, the impact analysis, I want to see, I don't want to see, I just want to see the plain lineage. So let's look at the metadata part, and let's take, first of all, look at the inconsistencies. So this is actually relatively straightforward. I can select the space and then simply say, find me all the inconsistencies. And here you go. So you can see it was basically scanning close to 500 like columns, and it found basically 160 unique columns, and there's like 22 of the columns that I have are inconsistent. And then the inconsistency are highlighted. So you can see, for example, in the beginning, we have an item billing status, which comes out of our analytical model, which is called billing status. But then the same field is being used in the table, and there it is called billing status, A uppercase and B without the space. So this really helps you to kind of like catch those inconsistent namings, to make sure that at the end your business user, is, I'm pretty sure you have heard this, that a customer is always a customer, and it's always a customer, and it's always a customer, right? So that's what basically this is about. The other part I want to show is the option to copy items. This is really just saving you a lot of work and time. So in my case, I'm going to go in and say, yes, I have like items that, for example, I have remote or like local tables, and my views don't have all the same labels yet, for whatever reasons. And instead of me going like, 150 fields one by one and potentially on 3 or 4 views, I simply basically want to do this in one go. So I can go in and say, I have a local table address, and I have a view called address. So the system is then inspecting both and putting together a comparison, is trying to match basically on a technical name perspective, and will then show us all the labels that are the local table is using and what the labels are that the view is using. And I can then decide if I actually want to make the change. And the important part, I can make these changes right here. I don't have to go back to Datasphere. I don't have to basically kind of like do this on a one-by-one level. We will add this as a bulk mode as well, where you can actually have 10 views in one go, as an example. So you see now the result. So it was able to match 12 columns across those two assets. And it says, well, 10 of these have different labels. So for example, you see we have address ID and then demo address ID. And it says, here's all the items that are different. So I can actually now go and say push, which means it will take the source label, put them in the target, deploy it inside of Datasphere, and basically you have now the labels in sync. The other part I also want to show is exposed views. This actually allows you to retrieve a list of views that have been configured as exposed for consumption. So that means things like Power BI, Tableau can access it. But in addition, we just quickly show, has there been a data access control configured? Because remember, the data access control has to be added to the view manually. So we just want to make sure that everybody is aware these items are exposed, and potentially you missed the step of, for example, putting actually the access control into it. The naming convention. So here we have the option to define rules. So in my case, I defined a rule for the analytical model where I said my analytical model at least has to have like somewhere an underscore AM underscore in the naming. My table has to start, for example, with an LT. And I can simply choose the different asset types and put in rules in terms of names. So as an example, I could have a view and say, well, my view should have something like underscore VW underscore in there, just to make it very simple. So then I can go and say, I want to validate this. I choose my space. run the validation, and it comes back and says, well, you got 50 assets. One of them is compliant. Oh my God. 42 are not. So, and then it shows you what are the non-compliant items. And you can see, for example, my AM, instead of actually having the AM in the name, it starts with the AM, which based on the rules, it shouldn't, right? So this is kind of like a very simple check that you can validate kind of like if everybody follows your naming conventions. Couple of other things that I want to highlight before we kind of like come to Q&A and also come to the end here. We do have the ability to update the semantics. So as an example, I can very quickly load basically artifacts. I can choose which ones I would like. For example, let's take the table. It loads all the columns, and I can then choose either to update the labels directly within the cockpit, right? So I can say, I want to change this, which then I can, for example, go in and say, I want to make this change now and push it. Or I can download the whole thing for multiple artifacts in form of an Excel sheet and then make the changes in the Excel sheet. I go to the upload option, put the Excel sheet in, and we will make the changes. We're also allowing you to define a transport list. As I mentioned, the export option inside of Datasphere doesn't catch always all dependencies. So what I can do here is I can say, okay, I have basically what objects do I want to transport? Like what is your starting point? So in this case, I say I want to have an analytical model being moved. I choose my analytical model. I can say, yeah, I want to see all the dependencies. And what then happens is it basically builds the full lineage, upwards and downwards, shows you the list. These are the dependent objects that you need to transport with all the technical names. But also important, it tells you there's 3 scheduled persistencies. There's a transformation flow runtime setting. There's a deletion schedule on a table. And that information is all part of the spreadsheet so that when things are moved into production, you can go in, because these items as of today are not moving as part of your import and export in Datasphere. So as an example, if you're moving a transformation flow, things like batching and things like partitions, you have to reconfigure in your production environment. So then last but not least, we have like the task schedule and the documentation. So the task schedule, relatively straightforward. We go to the space and we're loading all the schedules, and then you can choose basically which schedule you would like. And I guess this is the demo effect now. So here's your weekly schedule. Here's your monthly schedule. You can choose which time zone you want. You can see the schedule at the bottom, including, like, for example, how it has been scheduled, like every Monday and so on. So that gives you a little bit of an idea how much loads, so to speak, you're actually putting on the system based on the different object types. Documentation, pretty straightforward. You choose the space, and then you choose which object types you would like to document, and pretty much it builds a full-fledged documentation for you. So let me actually go back to the slides, and then so we open up for questions as well. So based on kind of like our conversations we've had so far, this, and I would hope you would agree and you kind of like can see the part, this does basically help you saving quite some time. Just imagine, for example, all the label inconsistency. If you have to go to like 10, 15 tables and views and change the labels one by one, so to speak, it still takes time. Think about the transport. If you're missing an object to move from dev to QA to production and you have to do it again, first of all, you have to find all the dependencies and then you have to move it. So there's a lot of time involved. Basically, why should you look at this? This was built on basically from the ground up. This is designed for Datasphere. And this isn't just kind of like things that were, so to speak, picked out of the air. This comes from actually practical experience. This comes from actual projects. So before we open up for a Q&A, and again, there is basically also the option, if you would like, you can actually, and you get the slides afterwards, you do get the option to register for a 30-day trial. And then basically you can play around with yourself. This is a complete SaaS solution. There's no deployment or anything required. All what you have to do is basically you hook up your Datasphere system to our system, and pretty much 5 minutes later, you can start looking at things in your very own system. With that, I would like to open it up for questions in case there are. If you do have a question, feel free to basically place it in the chat. So far, I don't see any question, which either means I perfectly kind of like explained everything, or everybody is just thinking like, kind of like, what would I do with this, so to speak? And I would hope it is the first one. So let me actually. Well, there is a question about kind of like which technology we're using. So this is all based on the command line interface for Datasphere. So this is basically talking to the Datasphere system using the command line interfaces. Okay, now some questions popping in. So the first one is, how does the solution work? You mentioned you connect to your solution on the cloud, how to start. So basically what the system does is, again, it uses the command line interface. So as part of the setup, you basically have to establish like your connection details, so your 0 out, and afterwards the system will connect to your actual Datasphere environment. So there's a question, will it help to automate the transport process? That is one part. What the command line interface as of today does not allow. We cannot create the transport package itself. What we do is we give you basically the list of objects that you should add to the package. And on top of that, we show you the configuration details, like a transformation flow, task chain schedule, because these items are not moving from your dev to QA system today. So can we build the package today? No, you still have to do that, but we give you the list of like technical objects that you should add to the package. The documentation, I didn't actually, so there's someone asking that you, and we will follow up with you, Patrick. I didn't actually kick off the documentation because in my space, there's around about 150 objects. So it would take a couple of minutes to go through everything and document it, but I can easily follow up with you and send you an example of how the documentation looks like. It pretty much has all the details from things like your descriptions, your owners, field names, field types, dependencies. It shows a visual, like where, for example, if it's a view, where the elements are coming from. So there's a question of how does this align with the roadmap for BDC? I would actually say that we're trying to basically close a few gaps that there are today in Datasphere from a management perspective. And we're trying to basically help our customers or other partners to simply close those gaps. So we're not kind of like doing anything, so to speak, outside of Datasphere or like anything that SAP covers. So for example, we didn't go towards monitoring because there's a lot of things on the roadmap for Datasphere from a monitoring perspective. So there's no kind of like need for it from my perspective. There's a question on when do you get the slides? you basically will get the slides and also the access to the recording pretty much a few days after this. And yes, you do get the slides. So then there's a question. So we have to generate the transport as we have been doing. Yes, so you still build the transport yourself, but I would say you have the confidence that you are moving the right objects. So I give you a perfect example. If you have analytical models and potentially part of actually you building this, there's transformation flows involved, you might notice that actually the transformation flows are not always adding up on the package automatically because they're not necessarily treated as a dependency of the analytical model. So you're missing items. So if you're just sticking to the default, you might move like 50% of what you need in your target system, and then you have to do it again. So you still have to build the package yourself, but we give you the right list, plus we give you all the configuration items that you have to do in production. For example, a task chain schedule. The task chain is moved from dev to production, but the schedule is not. So you have to go in and you have to kick it off and say, I want this schedule to run, for example, like every day at 8 o'clock in the morning, for example. So there's a question, CLI is based on API that will cost us? No, CLI is an interface. There's no, so to speak, price tag behind it. Any other questions? Otherwise, as we are running out of time, and Patrick, I will send you a follow-up separately. So Chris is asking, do we have a document that describes the gaps? So you will get the slides, you will get basically the items, what we can do. And basically based on that, you can see kind of like, what we're trying to address here. With that, I simply want to say thank you to everyone. And basically, if you're interested, reach out. As I mentioned, video and slides will be made available and you can take a look at that. Thank you.